everybody's attention. We're going to go ahead and get started. May have some people drifting in, but we're about 5 minutes late. I want to make sure we have people here. Got a great program scheduled for you tonight. Glad everybody was able to make it here. I want to give you a little recap first how I first met Nancy. They had a Civil War show up in South Haven, Mississippi a 3 months ago that I went to with a couple of friends from Birmingham. And they had a table set up there, talked about the Sultana Disaster Museum, which I'd never heard of, and probably some of you haven't either. She's got some brochures up here, so we said, hey, I tell you what, let's go up there and take a look at it. And you talk about being pleasantly surprised.
Yeah, I had to get a class.
It's a small museum. It's owned by the county, correct?
We're operated by Marion City,
Marion City, Marion County. And this museum has got some fantastic artifacts in there. They've got like a 1/10 scale of the Sultana built up. It's a small museum, but it's really nice. Got a lot of artifacts. Got pictures of just about everybody that used to own the Sultana. When you go in, you get a ticket. And the ticket you get has one of the people that was on the Sultana. Until you get through at the end of the tour and everything, you find out whether that person survived or not.
Oh, that's cool.
And they've got some great books there. 2 of them she's brought tonight. They've got 3. There's one they've got that she wasn't able to bring because she's having a hard time getting it, that was compiled shortly after the sinking, where a man that survived it wrote the book, but he went and talked to every one of the known survivors, correct me if I'm wrong, and had them write an article about how it happened with them.
Their experiences, that's cool.
Right, but anyway, this small museum they've got, just recently, they have been donated a gymnasium from a high school to expand the museum. And so they're going to move all this stuff in. She was telling me a few minutes ago that they've actually got a full-size replica of the pilot house that's going to be in this new museum. So you can actually get there and see what the man saw. So I think you're really in for a treat. You've got some great books up here. You've got some information about the museum. If you go up here, it's only about 20, 25 minutes past Memphis. Go to Memphis, go across the West Memphis, Arkansas Bridge. Once you cross the bridge, you turn north about 10 miles and you'll find it. Just plug it into Siri. It's called the Sultana Disaster Museum. And Nancy probably will be there.
Yeah.
She took us on a tour. It was a wonderful tour. I was really pleased. It's one of those museums that you don't know anything about. And boy, you go to and say, man, I've really missed something good. Has anybody ever been there before? Show me hands if you've been there. How many of y'all had heard about the Sultana? Okay. Most people, and I think Nancy will say this, you ask a group, says, what was the biggest United States maritime disaster ever? And everybody's going to say, the Titanic. This beats the Titanic.
That was British, though.
Yep, that's right.
From
But this one
was
beats the number of deaths on the Titanic. Well, anyway, without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Nancy Huff. She is
This is the video that we show at the museum when guests come to the museum, so we'll start with that.
This is filmed at the museum.
As the Civil War was coming to an end in 1865, the Adjutant General of the United States ordered that all prisoners be traded back and forth between the Confederacy and the Union. 2 of the most infamous prisons in America were in the South, in Andersonville, Georgia, and in Cahaba, Alabama. Between these 2 prisons, in the 18 months prior to the end of the war, almost 50,000 men traversed through these 2 prisons. The conditions within them were horrible. More than half of the men who were brought to these prisons died in the prison. Those lucky few that survived battles such as Gettysburg, Antietam, Fredericksburg, and Chancellorsville found their way into the southern prisons of Cahaba and Andersonville, only to run the risk of death within the prison. The survivors of those great battles and of the prison camps finally had hope. They knew that they were about to go home. The war was over. These ex-prisoners, anticipating their way home, were encamped just outside of Vicksburg, Mississippi, at a location called Camp Fisk, sometimes referred to as 4 Mile Camp. They remained here several days preparing to be boarded on board the boat, the Sultana, at the Vicksburg Harbor. The Sultana was constructed in 1863, and it was built at a cost of only about $90,000. It was, for its time, one of the elite steamboats of the Mississippi River. It was 260 feet long, 36 feet wide, and 42 feet in width at the beam. It was built to be 1,700 tons in weight and including freight, and yet it drew only 4 feet of water at the bow. The captain of the boat itself, J. Cass Mason, offered a bribe to one of the underling officers, a Captain Edward Tillinghast. This bribe was forwarded on to the Assistant Adjutant General in charge of boarding here in Vicksburg. And before it was finished, there would be 6 to 8 men involved in paying and receiving bribes, receiving favors, and simply dereliction of duty. The Sultana, over a period of 2 days, was loaded with in excess of 2,500 passengers. Of those 2,500, over 2,200 were former prisoners of war from the Cahaba and Andersonville prison camps. They were squeezed on board the boat in a manner that many had to be carried on and laid in place, unable to move around because there was no room. It finally left Vicksburg, Mississippi, en route to Helena, Arkansas, then Memphis, Tennessee, then Cairo, Illinois, and finally to St. Louis. One of the 4 tubular boilers was extremely weak, and it had been repaired within the last 2 weeks, just a small patch being placed over a very serious stress scene. The first morning after leaving Vicksburg, the boat arrived in Helena, Arkansas, where it picked up a little bit more freight and dropped off a few passengers. A man by the name of T.W. Banks was set up to take a photograph, which turned out to be the final photograph ever taken. If you look at that photograph, you will see that the boat is tipping significantly to the port side because of an overburdened passenger list, because of too much weight shifting to the port side in order to be in the photograph. On April the 26th of 1865, the boat arrived in Memphis, Tennessee, where it left off about 30 passengers and then immediately went directly across the Mississippi River to Mound City, Arkansas, where it took on an additional load of coal for the remainder of the travel upriver. After the boat left Mound City, it began to move northward up the Mississippi River against a very high river level, a river that was out of its banks and in a storm. At 2 in the morning, on April the 27th of 1865, the weakened boiler, stressed even further because of the extreme weight and the motion and the stress of the overflow of the Mississippi River, became overpressurized. One of the boilers, like most likely the weakened boiler that had been just patched earlier, exploded. With that explosion, almost immediately 2 additional boilers exploded. The explosions were very cataclysmic. It is estimated by some of the survivors that maybe as many as 400 to 500 people were killed instantly, with their bodies blown into the air above the Mississippi River by the force of the explosion of 3 of these boilers. There were no survivors found after the first 12 hours, and approximately 500 survivors of the explosion and fire were taken to Adams Hospital in Memphis, Tennessee. Eventually, more than 200 of those survivors would die of wounds and burns while in the hospital and are now buried in the National Cemetery in Memphis. The remaining passengers and crew, nearly 2,000, perished. It's an amazing story because so few people in American history have ever heard of this boat. It is the greatest loss of life shipwreck in American history. Why have people never heard of the Sultana? There were so many huge stories in that 24 hours. Themes that people were interested in, such as the surrender of Joe Johnson, the killing of John Wilkes Booth, and Abraham Lincoln's death train. Not to mention that after 4.5 years of war, people were tired of it. People didn't want to read any more about death, particularly large-scale death such as this. What makes the Sultana so important is it truly was the last great tragedy of the Civil War. It was the last great death, the last great event of the Civil War.
Part of my problem is I can't see well enough to. So,
Should turn the light back on for you.
I should be fine. I can tell you, I apologize in advance because of some of this information is going to be a duplication of what you just heard on the video. The video is shown at the museum at the beginning of a guest's first arrival at the museum. And I made the PowerPoint presentation to take to schools to teach various people about the schools. And one of the things I typically ask is, what's the worst maritime disaster in the United States history? And it seems like almost everybody says the Titanic. And of course, my first response is the Titanic was not a United States vessel.
Yeah.
And I said it just happened to have a lot of really rich Americans on the Titanic is why it was publicized so greatly.
There was a bad one up in the Northeast somewhere. There were 800 or 900 people killed.
Lusitania?
No, it was
Doria.
no. This was like in the early 1900s, I think, or late 1800s. And I'm thinking it was like they were taking people to a picnic or some sort of company function, and there were about 800 people that were killed.
My goodness. Well, this one is, yeah, this one, there's upwards of 2,200 people.
Yeah.
And to be honest with you, I don't know that we'll ever have a definitive answer. I don't know that we'll ever be able to acquire specific documentation that proves a specific answer. Let me put it that way. The Sultana was a side-wheel riverboat. It exploded in the worst maritime disaster in the United States history on April the 27th in 1865. It was built in Cincinnati, Ohio at the John Lithberry Boatyard. It was intended for the lower Mississippi cotton trade. So the Sultana's normal route was between St. Louis, Missouri and New Orleans, Louisiana. One of the first things that I noticed about the story was how young the captain looked. And I wondered if that was telling more about my age than it did his. But at any rate, to me, he looked like he was just a teenager. And we don't know exactly how old he was, but we do know that he was in his 30s, upper 30s. He may have even been early 40s by the time the accident actually happened. He was the captain of the Belle Memphis when the Sultana was first built and they got on the Mississippi River. As the captain of the Belle Memphis, he challenged the Sultana to a steamboat race, and the Belle Memphis won. Of course, when he became captain of the Sultana, he was also part owner of the Sultana. So when he purchased the boat, or purchased a portion of the boat, and became captain of the Sultana, he continued that practice of challenging other steamboats to races. And of course, so ultimately the Sultana won several steamboat races as well. Do you know why they had steamboat races back then? Well, they didn't have radio and TV advertisement. So the best way, as a captain, the best way that you could show that your boat was the fastest way somebody could transport their goods would be to be the winner of one of these steamboat races. And the winner would be awarded a set of elk antlers that would be displayed between the two smokestacks on the boat. So if you were a company in Vicksburg and you made some product for some customers in Memphis, All you had to do is go down to the Vicksburg Wharf, look for a boat with the elk antlers, and you'd pay the clerk of that boat to ship your goods to your customer, and you'd know that it would get there as quick as you could get it to them. Now, this day and age, you can't take a boat or a train or a plane or a cab or anything without everybody knowing everything that there is to know about you. Back in this point in time in history, the clerk of the boat was probably the only person who knew that particular cargo was on the boat or passengers were on the boat. The clerk was responsible for keeping track of what was shipped and how much was charged for it, the passengers and how much to charge for that and that sort of thing. One of the things that I didn't know about the captain until I had a gentleman who came through the museum who mentioned to me. I did notice when I first saw a picture of the captain that he had a single ear had been, he had an earring in his left ear, which was kind of uncommon for men to wear earrings back in this point in time, in particular just one earring. A gentleman came through the museum and he told me the significance of his wearing that one earring in his left ear. He said that as a Marine, as someone with a Marine background, the captain had apparently been on a boat previously that had sank and he survived it. And that was the significance of wearing the one earring. And then I researched it, and that is in fact the case. He had been on a boat previously that had sank. The Sultana had 4 decks, including the pilot house. The boilers were located, well, of course, the hull of the boat was where they carried the cargo. That was underwater. And the main deck, which is where the boilers were, that also was the motor and the gears and things that operated the paddle wheels. It also carried cargo. The next deck, they called the boiler deck, which I don't know why, because the boilers were one deck below that. And I call it the cabin deck because the next level up would have been where the cabins were. There was a large oval room, and the cabins were in a circle around the oval for cabin passengers. At this point in time, the boat would have cabin passengers who had a place to sleep in the cabin, and they also had deck passengers. And the deck passengers would sleep on cots or chairs or what have you in that center oval room. During the day, they would set up tables in that larger inside room and feed the passengers. And then at night, they would fold down those tables and put up cots for the deck passengers. Of course, they had so many people on this boat that there wasn't room for them. There was not enough room for everybody to even lay down. They were propped up against each other. They were propped up against the staircase. They were laying on stairs. They were sleeping on the railing of the deck. Anywhere that they could find was propped up against each other. Anywhere that they could find to get a little bit of sleep. And then above the cabin deck was what they call the hurricane deck. And a lot of these men were on the hurricane deck. And of course, that's open to the elements. It's basically just it's the roof of the cabin deck. And so there's no protection from the elements. And on top of that roof, on top of that deck, would be the what they call the Texas cabin. And that was the sleeping quarters for the officers of the boat. The captain and the officers of the boat would have slept in the Texas cabin. And then right above that would have been the pilot house, where the pilot operated the boat. During this time in history, it was considered one of the most magnificent and largest steamboats ever constructed. It had a legal capacity of 376 passengers and cargo, and that included the 80 to 85 crew members. So it was only permitted to take approximately 290 paying passengers. That 376 figure is a little bit misleading because I'm sure that you know that during the war they were in the habit of transporting more troops than just 376 at a time. They were in the habit of transporting between 1,000 and 1,500 troops at a time. The officer who made the decision that they could all go on one boat made his decision based on information that his underling officers had told him, and that was that there would be a maximum number of Union soldiers would be 1,500. So he thought that was something that was normal that they did. One of the things I did not know about the story, the first thing that fascinated me about the story was that I had never heard of it before. I was born in Vicksburg, which is where the story starts. I grew up in Memphis. By the time I was 6 years old, my family had moved to the Memphis area. I took American history, Tennessee history, right in Memphis, right across the river from where the accident happened. I never heard the story of the Sultana. I moved over into Arkansas, and I lived in Arkansas for 50 years. While I was in Arkansas, I went to college, and I took American history in college. Still never heard the story of the Sultana. I was grown. My kids were in junior high school. I have 2 daughters. They were in junior high school. I was helping a lady in the Crittenden County area, Margaret Woolfolk, wrote a book about the history of Crittenden County. And in her book is how I first heard about the Sultana. And of course I asked her, I said, Margaret, why haven't I ever heard of this story before? And she told me, of course, it was when it happened. April the 9th of 1865 was when Robert Lee surrendered at Appomattox. The 14th was when Lincoln was shot. He died the next morning. The 26th was when they caught and killed John Wilkes Booth. And of course, Joe Johnston surrendered on the 26th. Well, the next morning at 2 o'clock in the morning on the 27th was when this accident happened. So all the newspapers had, we caught and killed the person who killed our president, and it's the end of the war. And so, newspapers back then were the same as they are today. They printed what people were willing to pay for. But a piece of the story that I didn't learn until I started working at the museum is that these crew members of this boat had a pet alligator on board the boat. And if you would, make sure that each one of you has one of these and one of these.
Yeah, I only missed one fell back to the way back to the man.
Well, it'll show a picture, later on it'll show a picture. All right, and I've already mentioned the reason that so few people had heard of the story are these events that had happened. We may never know a specific, definitive number of people who were on board the boat. We may never know a specific number of survivors. We may never know a specific number of people who died in the accident. The way that normally in the military you would have a roll that would be counted, and the military would know everything about each person that they put on board the boat. Well, they were trying to get them home at the end of the war, and these people had been in prisoner of war camps, some of them upwards of 2 years. And of course, that would have depended upon how long it had been since they'd been captured. Some of them hadn't been captured but a few months, but some of them had been in there quite a while. And so they were just trying to get them home as quickly as they could. And because of that, what they decided to do, instead of creating the rolls as they normally would, they would just count them as they put them on the train at Camp Fisk, and count them again as they put them on the boat at the Vicksburg Harbor. Well, they miscounted. There were 3 trainloads of men that left Camp Fisk and got on the boat. They counted the first trainload and the third trainload, but apparently they went to lunch during the middle trainload because the entire second trainload did not get counted in either place. Now, there's, so we don't really know, and we don't have a way of knowing specifically. The person on the boat who was responsible for getting the money, payment, for each person that was on board the boat was the clerk, as I mentioned. William Gambrill was the clerk of the Sultana, and he told one of the passengers, he and one of the passengers had a conversation during the trip by river, and he told that passenger that there were approximately 80 crew members, there were approximately 100 civilian passengers, And there were approximately 2,400 paroled Union soldiers and 22 members of the 58th Ohio Guard Regiment. And of course, the 58th Ohio Guard Regiment was on board the boat just to protect the soldiers, because anything of any value would have been taken away from them when they were first captured, particularly their weapons, so they didn't have any way to protect themselves. So the 58th Ohio Guard Regiment was on board the boat just to protect the soldiers. Well, that amounts to over 2,500 people on board the boat. And so personally, I would tend to believe the person that's getting paid for it and his calculation over other calculations. Particularly since when they did try to recreate the logs, that's when they realized everybody had already been on the boat and gone upriver before they realized that they missed counting an entire trainload of people. And so I personally would trust William Gambrell's count of how many people were on board the boat more than I would practically anybody else.
Hey, ma'am, Ms. Huff,
Yes.
how did Will Gamble verify that clerk's report unless he saved the paperwork with him or something?
The paperwork would have been, that was, the office was,
Do you know if he survived?
I think he did for a period of time, but I'm not sure he was one of the long-term survivors. And this story, this information came from an officer that was on board the boat and had paid for his trip upriver. And he told that officer, Mr. Annis and his wife, he told them the calculation. Of course, now he could have been bragging, but I would lean more toward trusting his calculation than I would maybe
That's why
anybody
it's
else.
an estimate.
Yeah. And anything you're gonna get is gonna be an estimate. We even found, the museum opened in 2015. We found documentation after the museum opened that we believe that it's entirely probable that a lady and her 6 children were on board this boat that nobody had ever heard of before. There was a gentleman, of course, a lot of people were trying to move away from the South, get away from the fighting. There was a family that owned a farm in Searcy, Arkansas, and the husband had moved up north trying to get away from the fighting. He had written a letter to his wife to have her sell the farm in Searcy, and she and their 6 children were to have gotten on the boat in Helena, Arkansas. And there's evidence, there's the letter that's showing what she was supposed to do. There's evidence showing that she did in fact sell the farm shortly afterwards. But she nor the 6 children were ever heard from again.
Wow.
She didn't make it upriver. So it can be assumed that she did in fact do what she was supposed to do. And as a mother of 6 children, there's no way that any of them survived, because the mother would have been trying to save all of them.
Yeah.
The majority of the pro-Union soldiers came from 2 Confederate prison camps. Some, as I mentioned, only for months and some for years. Andersonville was one of those. It was Andersonville, Georgia, and then Cahaba was the other one, and it's located in Cahaba, Alabama, where the Cahaba and the Alabama rivers meet. Andersonville Prison was one of the most infamous prisons that there ever were. That's not to say that the northern prison camps weren't really bad too, because they were horrendous.
Yeah.
But Andersonville kind of goes down in history as being one of the worst, probably because the South lost.
Like Camp Douglas was.
Yeah.
Yeah, because of works in that trial.
And when I think of prison, I think of buildings, and of course that wasn't the case back in this time in history. It was just an open field that they corralled them in. And they had to cook their own food with food that they did get. So the conditions in the camp were absolutely deplorable. They were dying of starvation because by this time in the war, the Confederate Army was having trouble feeding their fighting men, let alone their prisoners. There was no protection from the elements. A lot of the men dug holes in the ground to get out of the sun. The stream that was running through the camp was their only source of drinking water, and of course, every time, with that many people living outdoors, every time it rained, it would have washed human feces down in the stream. So the water was contaminated.
Yep.
They were dying of dysentery, of typhoid, of influenza. Any communicable disease would have gone through the camp like wildfire. There were so many of them packed in there. And scurvy was another common problem because they didn't have fruits and vegetables. This picture is actually a picture that was taken at the Andersonville Prison in August of 1864. So it was taken just a few months before the April 1865 accident. These gentlemen are standing in line waiting for what little bit of rations that they had. So you can tell the crowded conditions, and you can tell how thin most of them are. Captain Henry Wers was the only officer from either the North or the South that was tried and executed for war crimes because of his treatment of the prisoners that were kept at Andersonville Prison. Of course, that result would have been totally different had the South won.
Right.
And whoever was in charge of the worst northern camp would have been the one that would have been in trouble.
Douglas and Port Lookout, yeah.
Yeah, would have been the one that was in trouble at that point in time. But Henry Wers was tried and executed for war crimes because of his treatment. There were an average of 13 men per day taken out of Andersonville and buried in mass graves. The Cahaba didn't have nearly the death rate. It was a smaller prison, and it was actually more overcrowded than Andersonville was, compared to how many they were supposed to hold and how many were actually in there. Cahaba was more overcrowded than Andersonville was. But Cahaba didn't have nearly the death rate that Andersonville did. They did have some of the similar conditions. It was an old cotton warehouse that part of the roof was missing. And as I mentioned, it was located where the Cahaba and Alabama rivers meet, and so it would occasionally flood. The men sometimes had to stand in waist-deep water for days at a time because there wasn't any way to lay down. There was water all around them. And as I mentioned, the conditions in Cahaba were just as bad as they were in Andersonville. They had starvation. They didn't have much protection from the elements, and occasionally the rivers flooded. There was diseases such as dysentery and typhoid and scurvy were extremely common. But they happened to have, their commanding officer was Captain Henderson, and he was also a Methodist minister. So he probably had a little bit more compassion for the men than maybe anybody else would have had. There is proof that shows that he did in fact do everything that he could to get food, clothing, medical attention to the prisoners that were encamped in his camp. Cahaba also had a couple of angels of mercy. There was a lady, Amanda Bell, and her daughter, Amanda Gardner, and her daughter Bell, lived in a house on the hill above where the Cahaba camp was located. So they could look down from their house and see the conditions in the camp. And with what little bit that they had, of course, nobody in the South had much of anything back then. Yeah. You couldn't grow any crops in your fields because there was fighting going on already. Yeah. All the men were gone to war anyway, so there was actually nobody in the South except women and children. But with what little bit that they did have, they would push food or clothing or blankets, notes of encouragement, things like that, through the holes of the fence to the prisoners, even though they were the enemy. They did what they could to try and help. And there is proof that Captain Henderson did as well. One gentleman that had been kept in Cahaba and was on the Sultana, William Bryant, wrote a book about his experiences at Cahaba Prison and the Sultana. And in his book, he tells that Captain Henderson was a prison keeper who was much admired by the men in prison, which is, almost totally unheard of. Some of the men, even after they were released, came back and thanked the Gardners for their help during their incarceration. As I mentioned, the Sultana story starts because it was the end of the war and the paroled Union soldiers were taken to a neutral place from the two prison camps to be exchanged for Confederate soldiers. Well, the neutral place was Camp Fisk, right outside of Vicksburg. And so they took the prisoners by boat or train or what have you, over from Andersonville, Georgia, Cahaba, Alabama. They took them over as far as Jackson, Mississippi. The train tracks were disrupted. Quite a few of them were disrupted because of the war, because each side was trying to keep the other side from getting fighting men to the area. So they even had a couple of train wrecks on the route from the prison camps over to Jackson, Mississippi. And then they had to march from Jackson to Vicksburg. It takes about an hour to drive, so you know it took them several days to march it, especially in the emaciated condition that a lot of these men were in. The Sultana's trip downriver, as it happens, of course, telegraph lines were disrupted because of the war. You couldn't get any news between the North and the South. So this boat actually was the first boat to come downriver with the news that President Lincoln had been assassinated. So she came downriver draped in black with her flag at half-mast, and newspapers that she had purchased from Cairo, Illinois to sell downriver with the information that the president had been assassinated. Merchants and People's Line was the steamboat line that had the contract with the government to transport troops. So they had a contract with the government. And it happened that the Sultana was one of the boats, one of the steamers that actually was in that Merchants and People's Line. There were bribes and accusations of bribes that directed the actions of some of the people responsible for transporting the troops. And those, not only the bribes, but accusations of bribes, false accusations of bribes, kept people from getting on some boats and took more people than should have been on other boats because of greed. And of course, there's no way to be absolutely positive of who is most responsible for causing the accident, most responsible for putting all these men on there. When the accident first happened, they thought that it was a coal torpedo sabotage by the Confederates, because that was common during the war. And so the summer of 1865, after the water receded and the Mississippi River went back in its banks, they came out and did a salvage expedition. And they picked up anything of any value that was still left around the boat. The entire boat had burned down to the water level and the hull sank. Well, they picked up anything of any value, and they discounted that original theory of a coal torpedo at that point in time. Because had it been a coal torpedo, the explosion would have happened in all directions at the same time. And it would have blown a hole in the bottom of the boat, and it would have sank. Well, the explosion happened 7 miles north of Memphis. It happened at a 45-degree angle out of the back of the boilers, and so it took out the pilot house. That one boiler exploding caused the other two next to it to explode, so 3 out of the 4 boilers exploded, meant that they didn't have steam pressure to power upriver anymore, but taking out the pilot house with the explosion meant that they didn't even have a way to steer it toward a particular shore. Well, everybody has their theory, and I'll have to mention my personal theory. My personal theory is Reuben Hatch. Colonel Reuben Hatch was the chief quartermaster at Vicksburg. So he officially, on paperwork, he was the person who was officially responsible for which boat they were transported, the men were transported on. That was the first thing. His entire life was fraught with corruption, allegations of corruption similar to this. While he was a civilian, he had a lawsuit against him for accusations similar to this, and he was defended and of course got out of that. After he was in the military, he was assistant quartermaster in Cairo, Illinois, and while he was there, he had kept 2 sets of books, one with the information he could show his boss, and one with the information that could show what somebody owed him. And he was demanding kickbacks for supplies. Of course, the quartermaster is the person who purchases supplies for the military. So as assistant quartermaster, he was getting kickbacks in Cairo, Illinois. He had thrown ledger books with the incriminating evidence in the Ohio River, and it washed ashore. So he was under investigation for a court-martial while he was in Cairo. As it happens, his brother, Ozias Hatch, was the Secretary of State for Illinois. and he was also a financial supporter and a close personal friend of President Lincoln's. So during that court-martial investigation, Reuben wrote a letter to his brother Ozias. Ozias wrote a letter to President Lincoln, and President Lincoln appointed a 3-man team to do the investigation for that court-martial. Well, mysteriously, he was cleared of all charges on that case. Well, between the time he was in Cairo, Illinois, as assistant quartermaster, and the time he got to Vicksburg, he was actually promoted. When he left Cairo, and the military sent him to New Orleans to be tested to see how qualified he was to complete the quartermaster's job, which of course he'd been doing for 3 years. Sadly, there was only one person who made a lower score than Reuben Hatch. So when the military commission's report came out, they recommended that they get Reuben Hatch out of the military. At the very least, get him out of the quartermaster's position because he was totally unqualified to do the job that he'd been doing. Well, because information traveled so slowly back in that day and time, it was just 10 days after their report came out that he was actually promoted to chief quartermaster. So he was chief quartermaster by the time the accident actually happened. So, and another thing that happened, he was one of the gentlemen that had gone to his superior officer. There was 2 other boats that left the Vicksburg Harbor at the same time that the Sultana left. The Pauline Carroll and the Lady Gay. And I may have that wrong, and so I won't name which one was which. But the Pauline Carroll and the Lady Gay, one left with only 17 passengers. The other boat left basically empty. It didn't have any passengers whatsoever. But Reuben Hatch had gone to his superior officer and accused one of the other captains of bribery. So the superior officer refused to let anybody get on that boat because of the allegation. They hadn't had time to investigate the allegation, but he wouldn't let anybody on that boat because of the accusation itself. And so that was the reason one of those boats left empty. And immediately after this accident happened, Reuben Hatch left the military. So they couldn't court-martial him because he wasn't under military control anymore. But at that point in time, they couldn't even get him to go back to the court-martial that did happen to testify.
Ms. Huff, he just resigned or he just left? I guess he resigned his commission.
He resigned as commissioner, if I'm not mistaken. But don't quote me on that because I'm not positive. But he did leave the military very shortly after this accident happened. And as I mentioned, due to bribes and allegations of bribes, the boat was not overloaded weight-wise. They could have carried a lot more tonnage had it been in the hull of the boat, providing ballast. But the problem was it was overloaded passenger-wise, which created a situation where there wasn't enough ballast in the hull of the boat, there wasn't enough cargo to keep the boat steady in the water. So the top heaviness of all the passengers on board the top of the boat would have caused it to rock back and forth in the boat considerably. And as I mentioned, the Lady Gay was the one that left completely empty, and the Pauline Carroll left with 17 passengers. Yeah, the other 2 boats. And had they separated these men on all 3 boats, it's entirely possible that all 3 boats might have made it.
Yeah.
You know. But now this captain knew he was part owner of the Sultana. But there's evidence that shows that he was already in financial straits. He had already sold off a good portion of his ownership in the boat to William Gambrill. And so he knew that this was coming to the end of the war. He knew that this would probably be the last group of soldiers that he would be transporting. So that portion of his income for the boat was about to go away. And he also knew that they had the boiler repair, the repairs that had to be made to the boat. So he had expenses that had to be put out, and he knew that a good portion of his income was going away. So he was willing to give a bribe in order to get as many men on board as possible. As it happened, the boat left New Orleans. It sprung a leak in the boiler before it got to Vicksburg. So while it was in Vicksburg, loading these men on, the boiler was being repaired. The boiler repairman originally walked off the boat. He refused to do the repair, because to do it adequately, he would have had to cut out that section of boiler and put on another piece of metal the same thickness of the original boiler, where they promised him that as soon as they got to Cairo, which is Cairo, Illinois, which is where they were going to offload the soldiers, as soon as they got to Cairo, that they would stop long enough to repair the boiler adequately, if he would just patch it in order for them to get to Cairo, to take these men home. So with that promise, he agreed to patch. And what he did was hammer down the bulge in the boiler and rivet on a thinner piece of metal on the outside of where the bulge was, where it was ruptured. This is the actual photo that was taken in Helena, Arkansas. It's been blown up so much that I always like to point out, you can't see a lot of the details, so I always like to point out, this right here, those are not people. Those are the horses and mules that are tied to the railing at the back of the boat.
Interesting.
The reason these two gentlemen are standing so much taller than the rest of the crowd is because they are standing on the only lifeboat that was on board the boat. There was one lifeboat, and from everything that I've heard from the survivors say that the lifeboat didn't save anybody. There were so many people that tried to get in the lifeboat that they actually sank it.
Wow.
You'll notice that there's nothing coming out of this smokestack, which basically tells you that there's no water in that section of the boiler. There were 4 boilers, but they were interconnected, so the same water supplied water to all 4 sections. So if the boat's tilted this way, which it clearly is, it's almost taking on water right here. If the boat's tilted this way toward shore, all that water is going to be in the bottom boiler. But of course, the top boiler is still going to be getting fire to it, so that metal is going to be getting red hot. And then when the boat tilts back the other way, that water sloshes on that red hot metal, it creates a massive amount of steam pressure instantly. And they do believe, ultimately they decided that that is what caused the accident, was water level and management of the water in the boiler. They made a 4-hour stop in Memphis on April the 26th, 1865. There were about 30 members of an opera troupe that disembarked, and they offloaded 250 hogsheads of sugar, which weighed about 1,200 pounds apiece, and a load of wine and a load of hogs. Well, from New Orleans to Memphis, all of that cargo was providing ballast that helped the boat, kept the boat from rocking back and forth in the water as much. The loss of that ballast in the hull of the boat would have caused the boat to rock back in the water more than it did between New Orleans and Memphis. So it was about 7 miles upriver when the boiler exploded at about 2 o'clock in the morning. As I mentioned, 3 of the 4 boilers exploded at a 45-degree angle out of the back of the boiler, which took out the pilot house. So the boat basically just drifted until it went aground. And as I mentioned earlier, we may never know the official count of the people that were on the boat, or the people that survived, or the people that perished. We do know that the official count by the United States Customs Service was 1,547 victims. But we know for sure that that figure is too low, because their figure, of course, is based on the inaccurate number of prisoners that was originally thought to be 1,500, whereas it turns out it was upwards of 2,200. I would think that a more accurate death toll would probably be more than the 1,800. Out of the approximately 760 survivors that were taken to hospitals in the Memphis area, some of those, of course, ultimately perished from their injuries. So I would say 500 or 600 was the maximum number of survivors, I would think. And then, of course, they have stated that the official cause of the accident was mismanagement of the water level in the boilers. And it was, that situation was exacerbated because of the severely overcrowding top heaviness of the vessel and the careening back and forth in the water. There were 3 military investigations that were started almost immediately after the accident happened. One of them started in Memphis within hours of the accident. There was, and ultimately only one person was brought to trial. As I mentioned, Reuben Hatch left the military. There was Frederick Speed, was the assistant adjutant general. I can't pronounce that, I'm sorry, I cannot pronounce that word. Assistant adjutant general at Vicksburg. And his court-martial, he was court-martialed and found guilty for severely overcrowding the Sultana. But his guilty verdict was later overturned by the Judge Advocate General of the United States because he never, Frederick Speed never actually saw the boat. He made his decision based on what his underling officers told him, and that would be a maximum number would be 1,500 Union soldiers. And so his guilty verdict was overturned, which basically means that nobody was ever held accountable for the